Hello again, friends. I thought I'd do a quick chat today about a project that I've recently been starting. Not real normal for me to talk about a project before it's nearing done or on a clear track, but I think this is probably a few months away, realistically, at the pace I'm able to keep up on it. So far, I'm about 40% done. And what this has to do with is that, as I've acknowledged in a couple videos, deliberately leaving out some details, I've had some personal challenges in my life. Simple version of that, loss of an immediate family member, alongside just other things going on. Like my business is fine, my relationships are fine. It's not those things. It is just other things that are part of life. And part of what's been helpful to me through those has been Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And so this is something where it is a text from thousands of years ago. So there's a bunch of translations available, including maybe a half dozen that are in public domain because they're so old translations. I mean, so this is, what's his name? Marek Casaubon. Not to be confused with Isaac Casaubon, who was involved in some Bible translations, some of the transcripts and those things. But this guy's, I mean, this is a translation from like, I think 400 years ago, 380 something. But because of that, like some of these translations, they literally include stuff like, whatsoever doth happen in the world, doth happen justly. And so if thou dost well take heed, thou shalt find it. And like, this isn't ironic, right? This isn't for style that he's literally saying mayest and doth and hath said and hath done. This was how you wrote 400 years ago in English. And one of the challenges people have, right, is that this translation, maybe, I don't know how much is the case, I'm no scholar for historical texts, maybe it was how you wrote and spoke back then. It's not now. And so we'll wind up with these problems where, so this is a Hammond translation. It's newer. This one's not public domain, but it's better. It still reads, I'm not even just going to try to go off the top of my head, but still reads pretty over the top, pretty intense. Part of what I like about this one is it has a whole section in the back that's his notes as a translator. Those are helpful for what my project is. And also, so what else is his name? Farquharson. Farquharson? I'm probably saying his name wrong. That's a 44 translation, and so that one's also public domain. In addition to, he has notes from his translations as well. And what I'm working on doing is weaving together these translations, these mostly public domain translations, in other cases referencing as secondary translator notes and versions that are more recent, to try to weave together a version of Marcus Aurelius Meditations that's much more modern human language. And this is, add them to the stack. Like I said, there's plenty of other translations out there. A bunch of them, they either have this problem of being so archaic because of the time when it was translated. The other challenge that some of them have is they wind up being so terse, kind of trying to overcompensate for that it loses, I feel, some of the clarity. Because ultimately there's a lot of useful ideas in it. There's a lot of useful material in it. I'm reminded of my dad when he would go to church as a kid, and he's obviously literally a whole generation older than I am. And they would go to church services where they would just go up there and read the original language texts to the congregation, and no one in the congregation spoke or understood the languages they were reading it in for the passages. It just kind of had this energy of like, well, you don't have to understand it. The words will somehow do you good. And no, like clearly we've come around to that of we take these texts that are meaningful to people and we translate them into forms and language that we can connect to, because there's a lot of language and things in here that is useful to us and ideas that are genuinely useful to us from part of what makes him unique as author's almost the wrong word. So for a bit of context on Meditations, it was probably, most parts were probably not intended to be published. To the best impressions, they seem to be notes to himself. There are parts that read a little bit more like, I say parts, there's like 12 different books in it. It's written over maybe a decade or more of time. But there are parts of it that do seem like they are voiced in such a way that they might have been notes for him to tell others or things to eventually adapt to some published work, none of which happened within his lifetime. But part of what makes it so unique is that Marcus Aurelius, who at the time was the Roman emperor, so this is a point in history of the world where Roman's empire was enormous, right? This wasn't like the modern day city of Rome. This was a sizable chunk of Western civilization at the time. And he had grown up with a lot of privilege. I mean, his father was the emperor before him, or rather, who raised him as his father. And yet, it didn't get to him. It didn't ruin him. It didn't spoil his character. And I think that's part of what makes it so interesting as an artifact of everybody else in history. Every other politician we can imagine, every other person who's inherited a lot of wealth, inherited a lot of position, inherited a lot of privilege, had a lot of advantage, somehow gets really screwed up by it. And as much as anything, the fact that Marcus Aurelius was able to take the privilege and opportunities that had been given to him in his youth from his father's means of basically acquiring whatever care, help, tutors, training were the best in the world that he could afford. I mean, obviously his region of the world, it still is Western civilization, for better or for worse. But that he was able to take that and really apply it, and not just sort of repeat that stuff at a cocktail party on the surface, but to really live by it, on top of maintaining his duties as Emperor of Rome. Fascinating stuff, and also it just deals very concretely with lots of ideas. And here's the other part where, in modernizing it, part of what I do like about it, and I say this more tongue-in-cheek than anything, but like, when I'm dealing with challenges, it's a book that is kind of as close as to what I have as a secular person who practices Stoicism as a personal lifestyle and for many years. Kind of like a Bible. Again, it's not a Bible. Specifically not. No one, including him, would ever claim this was some sort of divine word or anything of any, I don't know, privileged access in terms of knowledge of reality any more than any other person. It's a lot of it is thoughtful, discussive, raising questions. But what I like about that is he will often literally couch his arguments in his statements about ways of living or ways of thinking or ways of what we do and don't stress over, literally in two versions. And basically he goes so far as, for a lot of his points, even his notes to himself, to say like, all right, well, here's the deal, right? If the spiritual people are right about what they think, such and such is true. If the non-spiritual people are right about what they think, turns out you ought to live the same way anyway. And he does this really nice job, I think, of treading that space of, it doesn't have to conflict with your beliefs. It doesn't have to conflict. It doesn't have to insist upon you believing certain things. And I find that can be a much better neutral middle ground in the same kind of way as it's another Dalai Lama modern text, where he does a great job of kind of pointing out that, like, because we welcome so many different people's communities, cultures, backgrounds, lifestyles, sources of personal ethics, and so on, it can be very, very useful to find a grounding in something that is more neutral, something that at least we can all agree doesn't disagree with the way we were raised, with the things that we consider core to our beliefs about the world, and so that's some value to it. But one of the things that happens is that, just as a fluke of language, as a fluke of history, as other kind of things, it's a bit like when you take an old text. If you take an old quote from, heck, even like, say, I don't know, German idealist philosopher or something, they might say something and they'll use the word he, or they'll refer to man, when what they're really referring to is more broadly people in a modern context. But it was written at a time when, well, men were the ones who, at that point in history, had the access, had means, had access to education, had jobs at that point in history in a way that various sort of progress in terms of everyone, women, non-binary, and so on, being able to have access to different kinds of work. And so basically, even just taking some of the language and getting rid of some of these embedded assumptions about, like, okay, but why does every sentence have to be about men? Realizing, like, no, not really. I mean, it's like it's kind of the other side to this consideration of when people talk about old framers' discussions about people, and it's like, well, they're actually discussing, you know, landowning males as who they thought they were referring to in some of this text, and it's almost moot. Because here's the other thing about it: because it's not sacred, because it's not a Bible, because it's not anyone's claims to be some sort of divine work, and it's public domain. It's public domain several times over. I'm literally weaving together versions of multiple stacks of public domain versions, and modernizing the language a bit. It's fine to not have to get every single detail, right? I mean, so this is the same thing where when you're reading through this, and this is where the translator notes come in really handy for me. There are parts where he'll drop up a couple of names in his text, and it's things that, if they were modern day references, you would recognize, because he's referencing what were then celebrities, or what were then commonly understood stories, or what were then, I guess by now, mythology, And even then, there's some vague gray area, as there's some things he mentions that were even mythology by then, as opposed to what seems like mythology now. In other cases, he'll mention names, and you look into the translator notes who are lifelong academics dedicated to this craft of doing the research, and they'll just be like, yeah, as far as anyone can tell, we have no record of who these 3 names are. There's no way to know. And the first probably half dozen times I tried to get through the text, you just get hung up on these things. Of you either start to glaze over that pile of names and being like, I don't understand what I'm looking at, or you hit the names and you get stuck on it and you're like, you know what? I want to understand this. I'm going to look into it. And thank goodness for the translator notes, because if you didn't have those, it's a black hole. You're not going to find an answer because the answer doesn't exist. If there were other works, they've been destroyed. If there's any record of these people, no researcher on Earth has them. And so it just helps to be able to take that information and then rather than try to explain that in footnotes. Because here's the other thing, right? With my version, I'm not making what I'm doing here to be a resource for historians and researchers and academics and people studying Marcus Aurelius or the Roman Empire or whatever. My only purpose is to make a thing that's helpful to people, that's useful, that is practical, that's modern, that's translates as much as we can of his ideas, and I'll acknowledge as much as that there are little bits and pieces or cracks where it jumps around enough that you want to fill it in just a little bit, and that's where I think it helps that I'm not just someone who's approaching the text either as a, like say, historical artifact, but as a person who's like, well, decently versed in other Stoic writing, living as one for a number of years, to be able to at least, okay, well, there's a way to kind of work with this that connects to other parts of his text. And again, it's not to claim that this was the intention. It's not to claim that this is the authoritative version. It's not the point. It's to try to make what, as best as we can find, are points that were being made in a way that's digestible to a modern audience, in a way they can hear without feeling like it's either... so just an example. So one of their translations is about 150 years old. George Long's, his text is public domain. There's a really good audiobook version of it. It's one of my favorite audiobooks period. The George Long translation, it's on Audible. It's a really great narrator and reader. It does suffer from this effect where it feels a little bit like, not as a negative, but it feels like a little bit like a church reading, just because, again, it's an antiquated language from 150 years ago. The narrator's got a very kind of booming tone about him, which is nice. It's memorable. It's impactful, but it still has all these historical, archaic details spread throughout. It has all the nuances, has all the incomplete sentences, has just these notes to self kind of fragments. And it's the same kind of vibe, right? I mean, if we look at this oldest, like I say, oldest, not even the oldest by long, by far, but like this like 400-year-old version. Let's try to find a good page that shows us. I mean, you get kind of the wrong impression if you look at some of these because they're broken up into little subpoints. Yeah, you'll get like an entire page of text without even a new paragraph starting. And I'll be honest, I don't know how much that's an artifact of the original language. I know some of the old philosophy, granted that would have been maybe Greek and not Roman, was essentially just a big old slog of text. I don't know how much that's because it was notes to self. I don't know how much that's a translation artifact. But obviously that's not how we read today. That's not how we think today. And so I'm working on it first, this text. I might attempt a reading of it. I don't know that I have the voice or tone for that impact. And so here, let me just give you a kind of an example, right? So I'll read maybe the first section of book 1, just as kind of an example here of, and maybe this will be awkward and I'll be like right on camera here just as I try to read this. Maybe I can catch a little correction as I do it. But here's an example where the first several times I read it, like it was off-putting to me, it almost lost me, where the entire first part reads like a special thanks. The entire first part, it's a whole bunch of, thank my mom, thank my grandma, thank my brother, thank my teacher. And when you see that stuff in a lot of modern text, you just kind of skim past it, you glaze over, it doesn't mean anything. And I didn't really appreciate until I got deep into a dozen plus readings and re-listenings to this text, and then B, digging into those translator notes and looking up the details of these names mentioned and so on, some context around like, this is actually a pretty important chapter for setting it up. This is actually pretty fascinating for a variety of reasons. One is that he at no point is claiming, these are my ideas. You should listen to me. I'm the one who knows. He's basically starting off from the bat and saying like, look, I've collected thoughts from like dozens of people. These are some of the best influences I've had in my life. And these are the thoughts that I gathered from them. in a way that's really kind of helped setting up a context for the whole rest of it is sort of surrounding, supporting thoughts of a lot of the things that here he starts off with, like, here are traits I picked up from people that I determined to be worth picking up. Here's who I credit them to because it's not from me. And for someone to, again, have this position of power and privilege in life and in the world, and to not want to seem like I have all the answers and I'm right and I'm the one, but instead to say, I'm a person among many other people and trying to make sense of things, that here's how I've been able to navigate it. Let's just get right to it. So this is book 1. And again, this is my sort of attempt at modernizing some interstitials between various kind of translations. I will say that these, my first several books of the 12 that I've worked on so far, I did lean a little more heavily on some of the more modern translations. The later books, I'm leaning much more heavily into some of the mid-range and dates and stuff. I guess maybe not important here, but so this one might have a little more different vibe. We'll probably give it another pass before I kind of finalize this stuff. But book 1, here we go. See how it is with me reading on camera if it's not too weird. I've learned what I know about living from many good influences in my life. I do not claim to be the sole originator of these ways of thinking, which I'll be sharing. I learned my morals and anger management from my grandfather. I learned modesty and bravery from my father. I learned reverence, giving, and restraint from my mother, in relation to both thoughts and actions. She also taught me about simple living, how to live without being beholden by the habits common to wealthy people. I learned from my great-grandfather the value of investing in the best education I could. Switch mice so it's less loud when I roll. I learned from my teacher to not become overly caught up in public entertainment or the spectacle of sport. I also learned from him to endure hardship, need very little, to work with my hands, stay out of other people's business, and not hunger for gossip. I learned from my art teacher how to not waste time on unimportant things, to not believe those who claim to work miracles or drive away demons, to not harm animals for sport or to be excited by such activity. I learned to accept plain speech, to give serious attention to philosophy and wisdom shared by thoughtful people, to write beginning from an early age, and to be grateful for even basic necessities. I learned from a contemporary Stoic elder that I needed to work actively on developing my character and discipline. I learned not to get caught up in arguing just for argument's sake, not to lose myself in speculation, not to show off or do acts of kindness with the purpose of bringing myself positive attention. I learned to not wear fancy clothing simply to be around my home. I learned to keep my writing to the point. I learned to be quick to forgive people who wronged or upset me, to return to my peace if they will. I learned to read carefully, to not settle for first impressions or automatically accept interpretations offered by others. I learned from him the importance of works by Epictetus, who became the single greatest influence on my own thinking. A quick interjection on that, by the way, for context. I mentioned as much in Self-Command audiobook, but so Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, obviously kind of, as much as someone could at that point in history, kind of had everything someone could want. Epictetus, whose work was literally the strongest influence on Marcus Aurelius' thinking as a Stoic. Epictetus comes from the other side of life spectrum in terms of opportunity. Was, if I'm not mistaken, born into slavery, faced a lifelong physical limitation to his mobility, and just did not. I mean, the other side of the spectrum, again, for that person's writing to reach this person and for that to work for both of their lives, speaks to the generality of, this isn't just for privileged people, this isn't just people who are in a desperate situation. Anyway, back to point 1.8 in book 1. From my Stoic teacher, I learned to focus on my purpose, to act with certainty regardless of how chance may lead to misfortune, to trust only in my reason, to be consistent as a person, unchanged even when I'm in pain, going through the loss of a loved one or experiencing lasting sickness. I've learned through his example, it's possible to be passionate yet also compromising, patient in explaining things to others. I learned to accept favors by others, without either coming to rely too much on them or taking them for granted. From a professional philosopher and lecturer, I learned to keep a kind manner, to lead my family, to be brave, to live consistent with what nature requires. I learned to be somber without trying to impress others by unnecessary show of it. I learned to care for my friends, and also how to tolerate ordinary, ignorant people who form their views from insufficient consideration. I learned from him how to be agreeable and readily accommodating to anyone, to be enjoyable to speak to without resorting to flattery, to earn the full respect of company kept. He showed me that life principles can be discovered and put in order. Through his example, I saw how to not give off anger or other passions, and to be free from passion's control, while still being affectionate. I learned from him how to show acknowledgement, without it becoming excessive or showy. He demonstrated it's possible to know a great deal without needing to flaunt it. I learned from another tutor to not waste time on looking to nitpick imperfections, and not to argue with or correct people who speak in an inappropriate or incorrect way, but instead to naturally work back into conversation the better way to have said it. I learned to keep in focus the topic itself, to not get lost on the wording or semantics or the discussion of it. I learned from a speech coach to understand the uses of jealousy, whim, and hypocrisy as tools in the hands of those who lead without compromise. He showed me that many people who are well off through family fortune may wind up lacking when it comes to caring about people. I learned from a diplomat to never consider it a point of pride either to be lacking in rest, bragging yet complaining of being busy. He taught me not to use being busy as an excuse to fall behind on our duties to others. From a lecturer, I learned not to be dismissive of criticisms given to me by my friends, and that even if I determine their feedback isn't actionable, I should still see to it that we remain on friendly terms. I learned to speak kindly of my instructors and to genuinely care for children. I learned from my brother to appreciate family, truth, justice, and to be understanding of people who gave their lives for these causes. I learned to appreciate equal treatment of law for everyone, free speech, respect for citizens' freedoms. I learned from him my unwavering commitment to philosophy, as well as to practical ends to help others, to give when I'm able to be thankful for good times, to believe others when they speak kindly to me. I also learned from him how to be frank, even where there is disagreement, giving simple clarity to his communication to save others from needing to guess about his thoughts or manners. I learned from a senator the importance of self-control, to not allow my focus to be swept up by outside distractions. I learned from him to be cheerful even when I'm sick. He showed me how to be kind without being trampled on, and to tend to my responsibilities without complaining about them. I appreciated the way his ideas and words were consistent, that he was well-intentioned, that he guarded himself from making poor decisions due to panicking. He didn't needlessly hesitate or put off what needed to be done. He did not become overwhelmed or downtrodden, but also made no efforts to conceal or accept making light of if he didn't understand something. He made a point to help others, to be quick to accept apology, to speak truth. He earned a reputation that he would not be led astray or corrupted from what he saw as the right thing to do. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. No one felt he hated them, or got any impression that he thought of himself as superior to them. Atop all this, he maintained a healthy sense of humor, and such a life, and such a style that he did not offend or alienate others. I learned a lot of my demeanor and perspective from my adoptive dad, who served as the emperor of Rome before I did. Section on his dad is a little bit longer. He remained calm, was difficult to upset, seemingly never thrown off balance. When he made up his mind to do something, having put in the work to make the right choices about what to do, he persisted and followed through on the decision, unwavering until it was done. He didn't concern himself with vanity over awards and honors. He was industrious and determined. He listened when others had input on what to do better in the common interest. He was firm in boundaries and fairness. My father knew which situations call for intensity and which others call for being gentle. Despite his position of authority, he thought of himself as no better than anyone else. He didn't impose his company on others or become angry when they couldn't see him while he was traveling through their area, and was likewise understanding of those passing through his city who were unable to set aside time to catch up. I noticed how my dad was especially thorough in informing himself to make good decisions, that he did not assume his first impressions to be true. I noticed he was patient with others, did not act bored of the people in his life, but at the same time did not overdo his expression of excitement over seeing them. He remained content and cheerful. He anticipated what would happen and prepared accordingly. He helped people in need without making a show of it. My father knew how to be careful when it came to assuming what delights the most people is not necessarily the very best thing to do, and he remained cautious of the influence of flattery. In his professional duties, he was mindful, responsible, and accepted regularly being on the receiving end of blame as simply part of doing his job. My dad did not concern himself with trying to win the favor of any supernatural beings, of wriggling to get on the good side of powerful people, or of the majority of common people by telling them whatever they might want to hear. He kept a cool head, stood firm, and was not cruel inside or out. He resisted the allure of novelty, dismissing whatever could make human life seem cheap, interchangeable, or expendable. In times of life when he had means, he showed no pride or shame in their use. And in times when he did not have means, he did not feel either lacking or fixated over what he could not have. No one could accuse my father of speaking to manipulate others. He was not a fraud or poser. He learned from experience how to manage issues, his or anyone else's. He learned to respect people who have real wisdom, yet did not waste his time and effort arguing with people who mistakenly acted or imagined as if they had wisdom, while also not falling for their mistaken views. I learned from my father to be sociable and show a sense of humor, without taking either too far. He took responsible care for his health to, at least to the extent reasonably within his control, minimize the need for additional doctor appointments or more medicines. Not from an obsession over how he looks, or out of any fear for death, but simply to not be reckless with the only body he had. My father demonstrated the value of deferring to those who have specialized in a field outside his strengths, whether law, local customs, or any other field. He worked with them constructively, accepted their help without feeling threatened by or in competition with, their mastery being of a different topic than his. Speaking of local customs, he acted respectfully consistent with the institutions and traditions where he went, without making unnecessary show over this, but instead to blend in, without having out-of-place behaviors distract from either his purpose or message. I learned from him to not feel compelled to make changes simply for the sake of doing so. He didn't mind staying in one location, tending to the same things that he had always determined to be the best use of his time. If illness or other circumstance threw him briefly off routine, once he recovered, he picked right back up where he left off. He didn't keep many secrets, except those few which for his work responsibilities had to be kept confidential, when deemed for public good, among politicians and military leaders with security clearance. When it came to expenditures of collected tax funds, he remained modest when it came to spectacles or civic buildings, focusing on what is the right thing to do and not prioritizing the impact on his reputation or people's feelings towards him. My dad didn't get caught up in obsessing over his appearance, stressing over nicer or newer homes than his, craving extravagant foods or expensive fashions. He lived down to earth and frugally, even when he had the means and position to have the finest things. He never came across as harsh, hostile, or violent. He didn't seem to get stressed or hurried, but went about his responsibilities calmly, clear-headed, methodically, as though he had plenty of time to do things right, which he tended to do with steady determination. Like has been said of Socrates, my father had the strength to handle in moderation, to be equally fine with or without participating in vices that many other people either become addicted to or have sworn off entirely. I feel fortunate to have had such good role models among my grandparents, parents, teachers, associates, peers, and sister. I'm equally grateful that circumstances never led to my unintentionally offending or setting them against me, admittedly having acted in such a way some years as to have been likely to be the one to blame had there been disagreements. I believe it was to my benefit that I did not get too early into romance while I was still young. I admired the example set by my emperor and my father, and how he lived in a palace yet did not feel a need to surround himself with impressive bodyguards to emphasize his status, to be around only finely dressed people with extravagant decorations. He was not so insecure in himself as to need to make a constant show of distinguishing himself from everyday citizens. On the other hand, he behaved consistent with the responsibilities of his office to look after the well-being of his people. He did not allow his informal dress or decor to translate into careless thoughts or laziness towards his duties. It was my brother who showed me the importance of taking decent care of myself, besides which I always enjoyed his company and respect. I have had advantages which I do not take for granted. I am fortunate in how my children have been born healthy. I have benefited, in a way, simply by not having enough early success or signs of promising talent in creative fields, or other time-consuming disciplines, as to have sunk a large share of my life and focus into working at mastery in them. I had ways to grant positions of honor to the people who tutored and helped me, and I am glad to have done so sooner rather than later. My path has been immensely better off from my having the opportunity to learn directly from politicians, professors, and philosophers. It has helped me that I've gained an increasingly clear sense of how to live my life in a way consistent with nature and reason. And though I have not been perfect in adhering to this knowledge, I at least have not had barriers preventing me from the option to do so. I am thankful for my bodily health over so many years, and that I have successfully avoided a lifestyle that could have risked my health needlessly. I consider myself cured of excessive romantic passion, and it's warping my ability to reason. Though I did find myself angry at times, it never reached a point of doing or saying anything I felt it appropriate to regret. Though my mother passed away at a comparatively early age, she and I were able to be together near the end of her time. How remarkable it has been that, owing to my lot in life, anytime I've wished to help a specific poor person, I've had options and ways of doing so. Or likewise, when needing to help myself, I did not have to endure the challenge of lacking financial means. My wife has been agreeable, kind, and supportive. My kids have had access to good tutors and caretakers. When I've needed answers to avoid becoming ill, my instincts and simple rest seem to have served me well. When I became interested in philosophy, how fortunate I am to have not wound up led astray by someone manipulative or confused, or lost on documentation of trivial historical details, or solving arbitrary puzzles for their own sake, or speculating about what is unknowable, rather than finding first and foremost the actual, practicable ideas of philosophy. And so that's the end of my current draft on book one. Like I say, it's a 12-book collection book here, kind of loosely, temporally combinable parts of text from phases of his life when he was writing these things. When I talk about modernizing it, I mean, one of the things that I do, right, is, like I say, besides language and even some simple things we take for granted sometimes, like gender and male being assumed the default. Another thing I've also been sensitive to is that there's some details that in ancient Rome could be just mentioned in passing that in a modern audience are very distracting. This could include romantic relationships with people who are too young. This could include slavery. This could include a variety of things that at that point in history, even if people knew like these aren't good or these aren't popular or they're bad, they lacked the modern clarity that we have now as far as like, not only is it bad, as soon as you bring that up, my thoughts forget whatever you were talking about and become about, hold on, what'd you just say? And so part of the adaptation too has been really trying to figure out, okay, where was an incidental mention to those things not of high enough value to delivery of the key message that shedding it better serves the function of, hey, there's a vessel here of ideas that are worth hearing. There's a set of things that have been helpful to people, been helpful in a range of situations, wanting to make those more accessible. On the point of accessibility, I'm not yet figured out exactly how I'm distributing this. My current thinking is I might actually, there's a chance it'll go straight to public domain since I am mostly reworking for public domain text anyway of a public domain work. That said, it's a non-trivial amount of work. I've been putting in hours a day on my meshing those translations and editing and so on. If I do an audio version of it, then there's additional editing work that clears up. It's not all improvisational reading like this was here, or just kind of on the spot. But I might also just take it and fold it into an add-on update to Self-Command, since that's already kind of an audiobook with transcript. I might literally just kind of wedge it in there since it's obviously a foundational influence on a bunch of the points kind of spread throughout that productivity audiobook that I wrote. Not yet positive, might be its own thing. Looking for ways to get it out there, make it more accessible without the same anachronisms as some of the older translations, like this guy here. Anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in, taking time to hear me out. I guess I'll put a mailing list link in the description. What was my Self-Command audiobook mailing list. I'll put a list link there for if you want to join that, because that is the list I'll still be informing about when this version of this, whether it's a e-text, whether it's a public domain, whether it's an audiobook, whether it's all the above, whether it's free, whatever, it's going to go out to that list since it's so in line with the Self-Command audiobook stuff. Like I say, probably packed in as a supplement, no matter what else I end up doing with it. So that's the thought for today. I just want to share that I'm working on that, give a quick glimpse into what that's like, chat a bit about the thinking behind it, and yeah, catch you another day. Bye for now.